Good morning. I'm Harley Schlanger from the LaRouche Organization with your daily video update for May 27th, 2022. Well, I hope most of you had an opportunity to participate in the Schiller Institute conference yesterday on the lunacy of the war policy and how to end it. If you didn't get to see it, it's archived at theschillerinstitute.com. It was a very inspiring and powerful series of presentations from Helga Zepp-LaRouche, Colonel Richard Black, Ray McGovern, and others in dissecting the craziness of the idea that a nuclear war can be won, and that there are people in the Western military establishment who are pushing to the point where we may end up in not just World War III, but a nuclear war. So take the time to go to theschillerinstitute.com. It's the May 26th conference. It is archived, and I think you'll find it not just interesting, but compelling. And make sure you get it out to other people. Share it with people who need to get this intelligence. Now, it's Friday, so I'm going to take some questions today. I'm going to start with one that I've had the last 2 weeks, which is, do you have a reading of the situation in the Donbas in eastern Ukraine, the military situation? Well, the most recent reporting coming from both the more reliable press, which is the Eastern press, Russia and others, but even now is appearing in the Western press, is the analysis that says the Russian offensive is succeeding, that they've cut off the Ukrainian forces in what they call the cauldrons, that they are forcing the surrender of some of the forces, but the Ukrainians are telling them not to surrender. As a result, they're being forced to fight. Their casualties are high. Yesterday, 5,500 Ukrainian troops surrendered in the Donetsk region. And Western analysts are beginning to acknowledge this. And one of the things they're reporting is panic in Kiev. Kuleba, the Ukrainian foreign minister who was supposed to go to Davos, canceled his trip, possibly out of concern for the situation on the battlefield. Now, the best reading that I can give you is that of Colonel Douglas McGregor, who is a U.S. Retired colonel who was a late appointment by President Trump to the Defense Department, and he's been a very honest reporter so far. McGregor said the battle in eastern Ukraine is almost over. He said the Ukrainian troops are cut off. There are 30 to 40,000 of them that are with no route for escape, no supplies coming in. There are reports that the Russians are interdicting the supplies. They're blowing up depots, that some of the weapons that are coming in are not getting to the troops. McGregor's advice was that someone should tell Zelensky to negotiate for the best deal he can get, and that would be based on Ukrainian neutrality. McGregor also usefully said that there's no evidence that Putin wants to attack Western Ukraine or Poland, as some are hinting. He said, we're claiming that in order to demonize Putin. He said Putin is doing what he said he would do, which is to clear the Ukrainian forces out of the Donbas region to protect the population there and to go after the Nazi elements of the Azov battalion, the Aidar, and others. And McGregor said that he believes the American people think we should stay out of this, and I believe he's very much on target in saying that. Now, the second question is, what is Boris Johnson doing? What's the British plan? Now, Liz Truss, his foreign secretary, is out front day after day with the most militant shrieks that you can find of any political leader, even more so than Ursula von der Leyen or the others. Johnson, meanwhile, is still enmeshed in his own series of scandals. But there was an interesting report in the Corriere della Sera, one of the leading Italian newspapers, that talks about what is the direction of global Britain, which is the Johnson-Truss policy to extend NATO to the rest of the world. Now, what Corriere della Sera said is that according to informed sources, Boris Johnson has proposed a new political, economic, and military alliance as an alternative to the European Union. Of course, the British are out of the EU now. And some people are concerned that the EU is not a very viable institution, that its attempts to establish itself as a military alliance will not succeed. And so, according to this report, Johnson is thinking about establishing a new Commonwealth, which would include the United Kingdom, Ukraine, and Poland. There are talks between those three countries for a tripartite alliance, but also the Baltic states and possibly Turkey. Well, Johnson is part of the operation in the Pacific, which includes the US, the UK, and Australia, the AUKUS. The Brits have been all over Asia with Truss going there, Johnson going there, trying to win over India and other countries. So the idea of global Britain is something real in their minds, but it shows how deluded they are. The situation inside the United Kingdom is disastrous right now. The utility rates are going through the roof. Gas prices are high. The population as a whole is suffering from the inflation. And Johnson's whole grip on power is increasingly weak. How he thinks he can extend this to a new Commonwealth is beyond me, but we'll see. Obviously, his attempt to delude the British people depends on his own ego, and I don't think there's any end to his ego. Now, the next question came from a retired military person who asked, is the permanent war policy designed to enrich the military-industrial complex? Well, it's true, there's an element of that. And what you see when you look at that is that the military-industrial complex is committed to a policy of war and building weapons. But it's more than that. It's a mindset. It's an imperial mindset. The idea of a unipolar order, which has taken over most policymakers in Washington, both parties, all the institutions, the intelligence services, the diplomatic corps, that the United States is the essential institution for democracy in the world. Now, look, is Ukraine a democracy? Zelensky has shut down his opposition parties, shut down the newspapers and so on. There's certainly no democracy there. Is it democratic to have regime change policies enforced by the military, as the United States and NATO has done repeatedly? No, this is delusional. But their view is that the United States is the only country that can hold together an imperial policy, and that U.S. military then is in service to the financial institutions and cartels of London and Wall Street. And so it goes beyond just the defense sector and the military contractors, but into all the corporate cartels who are struggling now because of the economic policies that are increasing the debt to those companies without increasing their capability to service the debt. They've been doing that through quantitative easing. So it's not just that the military-industrial complex makes money when they build weapons and send them to be destroyed in Ukraine. It's that they use the military power to intimidate nations, to impose on them conditions in which they surrender their sovereignty in return for a few crumbs from the International Monetary Fund and the global banks. So it's much more a policy of holding together a collapsing world order than it is simply to make money. Now, we see the continued commitment to this in Biden's pick to become the new head of NATO command, General Cavoli, who testified before the Senate yesterday. And he had the same line on NATO expansion, that the idea of NATO expansion to Russia's borders does not expose the alliance to greater risk. And he was very open about this. He said the risk will be on Russia's side. Well, isn't that what Putin said, why he wanted security guarantees? So now a U.S. military nominee goes before the Senate and says, our job is to increase the risk on the Russian side. Well, that's the same permanent war policy. He praised bringing Sweden and Finland into NATO. He said this will fortify the northern flank. He said this will mean that almost all of the Baltic Sea coastline would be NATO members. And then he went one step further, blaming Russia for food shortages. Now, this is a continuing line from Blinken, from the British, from Biden. But here's an interesting point. The port at Mariupol will be open soon, and the Russians demined it. That is, the Ukrainians put mines in the port to prevent traffic from that port. And then also Kherson, another departure point for grain and other products. The Russians have been preparing to open the port, but the problem has been that the Ukrainian nationalists are shooting at anything that moves out of that port. So is it Russia or Ukraine that's stopping the food supplies? Once again, we see the narrative in the West is based on the same kind of lies that we've seen exposed over and over and over from U.S. military, diplomatic, and intelligence officials. Now, the final question is related to the economic one I just touched on. What is Biden's anti-inflation plan? Well, before you laugh, Biden is talking about how he's got a plan, he knows what to do, Build Back Better will deal with this. But he's got no plan. He's relying on the Federal Reserve to use higher interest rates to slow down inflation. And there's a report out now that the Federal Reserve is planning to have 2 more rate hikes in the summer of 0.5%, that is half a point each. And that will increase the tendency toward tapering, that is selling off the financial instruments that they've bought recently to keep the flow of liquidity. But there's a fear that will trigger defaults, a very real and legitimate fear, because if you don't keep free liquidity flowing into the banks to give to their corporate customers, how are they going to cover the debt that they've taken on in the last years of quantitative easing? They can't. You have a danger of a chain reaction series of defaults. So you have 2 different lines coming out. Former New York Fed chief Dudley gave a talk a couple weeks ago where he said we need a one-time 5% rate hike increase. 5%. He said that will put an end to the inflation. Well, it hardly will. What it will do is collapse things quicker. But now we have from the Atlanta Fed, Chairman Bostic, that there'll be a tapering pause in September. And then after that, they'll renew quantitative easing. Why would they do that? Well, because if you don't keep the quantitative easing, you're not going to be able to cover the debt. You're going to have debt defaults. Now, I'm not saying that's exactly what they intend to do, but that time frame coincides with the annual August Federal Reserve retreat in Jackson Hole, Wyoming, where the last 3 years they've announced policy changes there, going back to 2019 when they went into the last super phase of quantitative easing. Now, underlying all of this is another bit of delusion, which is most of these economists cited by the Federal Reserve and the business media say they expect a fairly significant U.S. economic rebound in the second quarter. How is that going to happen? Well, it remains to be seen. They may rejigger the figures a little bit. They may come up with some more money going into the speculative system, but it's not going to happen unless there's a fundamental change away from the monetarist policies of the neoliberals that have dominated economics for the last 50 years. We're headed down to either a collapse of debt, which would bring down the system, or hyperinflation, which will bring down the system. There's another alternative, which we have been repeatedly pushing, which is the LaRouche 4 laws, which essentially says, let's rebuild the physical economy. Let's re-regulate the banking system. If people want to speculate, go ahead and speculate, but you eat the losses. You don't pass the losses on through bailouts. And then what we have to do is make sure there's a credit agency that gives credit not to speculators, not to bailouts, but credit for new physical production and infrastructure and advanced science and technological processes. That's how you get out of inflation. That's how you rebuild the economy. And you do it with the rest of the world. So thanks for joining me today. I'll see you again next week. And don't forget to go to theschillerinstitute.com to watch the proceedings from yesterday's conference.